Hello, welcome to I Got Board Game. We're back on this Friday to share our thoughts on another game. And so today we are continuing with what we started talking about with Dominion, deck building. One of the games we mentioned then is what we'll be reviewing tonight. And that game is.
That game. Oh, whoops, wrong button. That game is Clank.
Clank.
Not to be confused with this Clank.
Ratchet and Clank.
This Clank.
Yeah, so this is Clank. And hopefully you guys can see it okay. It's for 2 to 4 players, plays in about half an hour to an hour. And just, I don't know if I ever told you, but the time I originally heard about Clank, so Clank is probably, a few years old now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Probably 2017, I want to say, maybe 16. Yeah, are you looking that up or?
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm
Okay.
looking it up right now.
But I remember just hearing about it briefly because that was when I would go to the board game store a lot, like local board game store, and I just heard the name Clank, and people started talking more and more about it, but I never saw it. But I kind of judged it really quickly when I first heard it. I heard the name Clank, and I was like, oh, it's probably like some robot battling board game. Like I don't care about that theme. And then I eventually saw
Robot battling.
like that one. And then I eventually saw like some boxes of the game on like one of the tables, like they were setting it up or unpacking it. And then I saw the picture, yeah, like John's background is showing. I saw the artwork and I was like, wait, it's like fantasy theme? Why is it called Clank? And then I read that it's a deck building game, and I was like, okay, this is like I seriously misjudged. Just from hearing one word, I judged too quickly. And so, I mean, again, back from when we talked about Dominion, deck building is not my favorite mechanic, but I would say Clank is one of the games where it works so well in. Like, it gets me into it. Uh, the theme, for those of you who don't know, it's actually fantasy theme, and it's called Clank because you're adventurers competing to kind of go down into these caverns to get treasure. And the whole point is you want to get treasure and get out, get back up to top side, to the ground, to the town. And you want to do so without dying because as you're going through the dungeon or the cave, you're making noise, clank.
You're
And so that's one of the
clanking
mechanics in
around.
the game. You generate clank. And the more clank you generate, you're basically indicating that with like your own colored cubes being put into this clank spot. And what that does is certain cards that get flipped over, if you remember in deck building, right, you're going to have different piles of cards to buy during your turn. As you flip over those cards, some of those will activate the dragon attack. And so the whole idea is that the dragon is attacking because you guys are making too much noise, too much clanking. And so then all your cubes, your clank cubes, that all that noise you made will be put into this bag, and randomly a certain number will be drawn. And if your cube gets drawn, your noise cube, your clank cube, that means the dragon attacked you. And so thematically, I thought that was really cool. That was really cool. Just like the whole name of the game is its own mechanic in the game.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, aside from that, it's also very unique. I know John probably wants to speak, but I'm not letting him.
Okay, I'll take the
is
rest of the time after.
the main thing is that it's a deck building game, but why it does it so well is it was one of the groundbreaking ones, right? That took deck building and mixed it with another mechanic. So it wasn't just a deck building game, which can feel abstract, right? You're just kind of buying cards, building your deck during the game. But in this one, you're building your deck, but the cards you're getting are like allies or movement cards, because the whole idea is your cards are meant to help you move through the cave. So basically the other half of the game, the other big mechanic of the game, is this actual traversing through a cave, moving on a game board, which I have here. I don't know if it'll fit, but John, you can talk while I'm trying to show the
Hmm.
top.
Yeah, and I think this is the part that really makes Clank a very special game in comparison to the other deck builder Dominion that we were talking about. But in general, even for board games at large, this is a very interesting and special way of playing the game where as you're playing your cards, they're actually moving your character around to different locations and you're actually exploring this dungeon, right? So it's the top side and then there's the bottom side of this dungeon, and you're actually exploring around, traversing as you're trying to collect these treasures throughout. And I think that combination with the fact that you're also doing a deck builder, where the deck building is effectively preparing your actions as you're going along through getting through the dungeon. And I think that's the part that makes it even more special as a deck builder, because it's, I think as we were talking about in the last video when we were talking about Dominion, typically a lot of deck builders tend to focus on getting a lot of points that just sit in your deck. But in this game, while you can get points as you're buying cards, your deck is not just about filling it with making sure that you can get points into the deck. It's also a matter of being able to continue moving around the board, because one of the things that can happen is your character can die as you're playing this game, as I think we were alluding to with the dragon attack. So you can actually take damage, and you actually have a health tracker. And there is a point in which you run out of health and you can die, and that can actually completely negate your score if you die what's called underground. So as I was saying, there's like two halves to the map. There's the above ground and there's the below ground. So if you're in the middle of the underground of the dungeon, no matter how well you're doing, if you end up getting knocked out, so that's the top side, which is kind of like the little castle place you're searching. And then the bottom side is the caves and the dungeon itself, which has a lot of treasure and a lot of opportunities to make points. But if the dragon kills you or other things may kill you down there, you get no points at the end of the game. Which means that it's not just a pure matter of collecting points and making sure your deck has points. It's also, can you make sure that you'll at the very least survive? And then there's also, if you escape and leave the dungeon, you do get an extra bonus for getting in and getting out.
Yeah, so this was one of those revolutionary games, right? That did that first step of mixing deck building with something else. It's not revolutionary in that, you know, there were a lot of games after that did the exact same deck building with some kind of dungeon diving, but it was just the very fact of combining with something else that wasn't, I can't imagine was really seen until just Clank came out. And as you mentioned also, so here are some examples of like cards that you can buy during the game to build your deck. And I think the theme is pretty cool. I mean, it is, people will say like generic fantasy, but I think it kind of does make fun of it in a way with either the art or the name of certain things. And I think that's kind of a little bit of its charm, you know, where it is fantasy, but then it's also references to like Star Trek or sci-fi things or random other things like that. Or actually, sorry, Star Trek and stuff would be in a different version of Clank, but this one has stuff to like Lord of the Rings or, you know, other fantasy IPs that people would know. So that's just a small thing that's fun.
Mm-hmm.
But then also I think like for the board itself, there are some details that are pretty like clever about it too, where it's not as like straightforward. It's not complicated to understand, but it's also not just straightforward like, okay, now I'm deck building and I have to keep track of moving, right? But there's stuff like these like crystal cavern spots that you can get to, which basically you have different resources in this game, right? Like in Dominion, those original kind of deck builders, you have maybe like a couple resources, right? Like Dominion had like action points and money to spend, where then in Clank you have like movement that you generate, money that you generate, uh,
Well, skill.
experience. Yeah, there's experience and gold, so two currencies in that way that you generate movement, and then well, and then your life. But then
And
movement
swords.
wise, like it's interesting that like there's these crystal caverns, which then if you move into it, it just eats up all your movement for that turn, right? So there is a kind of mix up there, which I think is smart, that you can't, it's not just straightforward, like move as far as you can all the time, but
Mm-hmm.
like there are paths that maybe lead to better treasures that are worth more points that you can see, but you're gonna have to stop more often to get to it.
Yeah.
So yeah, I
And
think
then
that's just
also
my
as
opinion from that.
there's other things too, like there's locked locations. If you see on the board, there's those little lock symbols. It means that you have to have a specific item that allows you to actually go through it, or there are certain cards that let you teleport, for example, and you can teleport past it in order to get around. There's also, as you see, there's like those little like faces, the little dragony faces. It's also kind of representative of these like monsters that are in the tunnel. So it's not like a card or anything that you have to deal with, but if you're going through it, you can choose. You either use one of the currency, the swords, to prevent yourself from getting hit as you go through it, or you can also choose to take the damage, right? Where it's kind of like you're just running as fast as you can away from it, and it hits you on the way out, but you get past it, right?
And
So
yeah, and
that's
those
also a
things
fun thing.
like make sense thematically. And yeah, you're right. That's the one I forgot. Like swords or combat is another resource. And it's also not to make it sound like there's like all this resource management, right? It's still done in a deck building way where you just generate it for that one turn, right? With all the
Exactly.
cards that you play. Then you're just keeping track of how much you generated that turn. If you didn't spend it, it's gone. Your cards are discarded too, and you draw a new hand. So it's not like actually a heavy resource management in that way. It's really simple. And then
and
there's
it, and
also
it, it
oh,
it fits that theme of what deck builders do, right? Where you have one turn, you do all your things, and it's the same way as you're adventuring, right? You're running through, and then you have your act, like the things that you do for your turn if you play like fantasy games and things like that. And then once you use up your resources for the turn, then you have to wait till the next one to go do your next thing. So thematically, it also kind of fits with that adventuring mindset as
and
well.
then the other thing I remembered with the board is there's also another shop on the board,
Mhm.
right? There's actually a spot that links to this little sideboard where in typical deck building fashion, there are, like I showed, like the whole deck of cards from which you can buy from every time during your turn, wherever you are. But then there also is a specific shop where you have to be on that space on the map to buy certain items that are on this little board, which is also a
Traveling
little,
merchant.
huh?
You're a traveling merchant
Traveling
that just
merchant, yeah.
happens to be in the dungeon, and you're like, "What
I
are
mean,
you doing
but
here?"
that's really clever too, right? Like this is the
Mhm.
one that uses gold, 7 gold to buy each item on here. But then, so it uses the other currency and it requires you to be on the spot to get it, to buy there. So that was a nice little mix up too, where it's, again, not just always the same pool of cards you're going to have to buy from anywhere. But if you really want these items, which are usually like healing, other points basically, but that aren't cards, so they don't, clog your deck, or a key that you mentioned, like then you would need to get to here and buy those specifically, and that's kind of the only way to get those items.
Yeah, yeah, and there's a couple other items too. I think there's one that's just a lot of points, so you can
Mhm.
actually just gain more points with your gold, which also count as points at the end of the game. And then there's one that lets you. So one of the mechanics we didn't talk about in the game is the fact that before you can escape and leave the dungeon, is you're basically, as a part of the theme of Clank and making noise, is you're basically down there stealing a dragon's treasure, right? That's why the dragon is attacking you. So you have to be able to grab one of its treasures before you can leave. And so one of the items, normally you can only grab one dragon treasure and then you have to run, right? But with a particular item from that shop that we were just mentioning, you can actually grab 2 items on your way out.
Mm.
So then it's just more options for you to get more points, right? But that's the variety in that particular shop, right? There's different things you can do with it, which is really fun as
And
well.
so in the way that I do want to point out that the way that it mixes moving on a board and deck building, like I do find it clever in that it's also not the same feel as like if you were to roll and move the whole game, right?
Hmm.
Like traditional roll and move games, Monopoly, Sorry, all those that people know, where I feel like it there is the kind of strategy that goes with deck building that I enjoy more than
Hmm.
rolling and moving, right? I think that's kind of my issue with roll and move games, right? It's purely luck how far you go, right? Where with deck building, there's still luck, right?
Hmm.
What you draw, and that does happen. Like, maybe you're the last person alive and you're trying to get out of the cavern, and you're like, I just need to draw this card. I know it's in my deck, and you like don't draw it, and you get
Hmm.
killed by a dragon, right? So there is still luck, but it's not pure luck. So there is still that excitement of like, ooh, I did build my deck this way, so it better help me do this right now.
And to that point, I think if you keep track of your cards, if you keep track of what you have in your deck, you can identify and you can keep like have a sense of what may be coming, right? So you can actually you can even like potentially plan your turns ahead in a way where you're like, I'm pretty sure I didn't draw this card yet, and I'm really planning on getting an item, like I want to buy something from the shop, or I see a card in the tableau that I can get to add into my deck. So if I, wait a turn and use my cards this way, or it's like, oh, I have a card that lets me draw more cards, that'll let me get to that card I'm fishing for or that card I'm looking for and then get it. Yeah. I was also going to say from a thematic standpoint, I think this game is also really fun too, because it's also like, it says a deck building adventure game, but this isn't like your standard D&D, like fighting and just trying to level up and things as a fantasy series. This is more of like, not heist, but definitely like a smash and grab kind of feel, where you're really playing as you're not playing as super powered like warriors or mages or archers or any of those like classes, rangers and such. You're literally just adventurers who are like, all right, we got to grab some treasure as quick as we can, and we got to get out of here as fast as we can. And that's also one of the funny things about this game too. It's like you're all going in the dungeon together, but you're also not an adventuring party in the sense of you're working together. You're kind of trying to beat everybody else and trying to grab the treasure so that you can come out ahead out of everybody else. So definitely know that this is not a cooperative adventuring game. This is a very, very competitive adventuring game.
It's a race, right? It's like there are limited treasures, right? The ones worth certain points, there's only one copy of it. So if you can build your deck to get there first, then you'll get more points. But maybe other people's decks by that point are more set up to keep them alive, So actually, I was also going to point out this idea of the decks, just to clarify also, right? I think a smart little design change too that made this game more kind of like in your face, more, it's still not directly competitive, right? Because you're not necessarily doing anything to each other. Like you said, you're not like fighting each other, but there is much more direct, more interaction with each other than say traditional deck builders like Dominion, right? Which is something you had mentioned with the last video, I think, right? Where I think one of the small ways that it introduces that is with the decks itself, where in Dominion, from if you know how to play it, there's basically you choose which decks of cards, which are decks of multiple copies of one card, right? Which decks you're playing with that game. So that's the market that you can buy from. Everyone can buy from. Where in Clank, you don't actually have decks of cards to buy from. You just have one deck, and these are all different cards. Maybe a few are repeated. I don't really think so.
There's some repeated, not many, but there are some.
Yeah, and so then to make the little pool of cards that players can buy from, you're just flipping cards from the top. Like 6 are revealed at a time or something like that. And so then once someone buys it, you replace that card with another one, right? So then that market is almost changing with every player's turn, right? So then you'll see stuff that you want that could get bought before it gets back to you, right? It's not as safe and indirect as just having decks of the same cards to buy from. And so there's that interaction there.
And I think Ben had kind of alluded to it a little bit, is we had mentioned the dragon attack. That is how the game escalates over time too, is that as you're buying these cards from that area, that is what triggers the possibility of the dragon attacking, right? Where it's like, it's hearing the adventurers going through, as we mentioned, you're generating clank, you're making noise as you're going through, and that as you're kind of acquiring more cards and you're kind of going through, it escalates the dragon's ability. And that's also one of the things that happens is when you're collecting the treasures, or there's other certain cards that will escalate the strength of the dragon's attack. As we mentioned, there's this bag that you pull from, and you just start pulling more and more cubes over time out of that bag, which means more and more opportunities and chances for everybody to be killed by the dragon. And there's the nice dragon bag, dragon attack
comes with the game. None of this stuff I've been showing is any special stuff, except maybe a few promo cards. But no, all these components are standard stuff in the game, which is well produced. And yeah, I think that doesn't remind me of like those funny moments where it's like I'm doing well, but that person has some more points or picked up another treasure. I'm gonna like buy random cards and hope for a dragon attack so they can get hit, you know?
Mm-hmm.
Like, again, that's like, I'm not attacking you, but there's this indirect way that I can try to get in your way to hurt
Exactly.
you.
And honestly, it's also kind of thematic too, where it's like, oh, you feel like this adventurer is getting ahead of you, then it's like you're kind of making a lot of noise, or you're kind of like trying to get the dragon's attention to come and attack. And that's kind of also part of the idea. So even as a base mechanic of what deck builders usually do, which is like the buying of the cards and stuff, it's incorporated into the way that you just play the game normally. And it I think it also helps in kind of escalating the game and moving it along too, where it's not something where people just spend a lot of time like, oh, why don't I just sit underground and just keep kind of farming or accumulating a lot of money or trying to make a lot of treasure just sitting here and just like right next to the exit. Well, it's like, well, other players can trigger the dragon to attack. It's not just a trigger that happens on your turn, right? Like if we're playing with 4 players, every single player, their turn could cause the dragon to come after you, and you will get hit, right? It's not like something that you're like, oh, you're safe because somebody else triggered it. It's everybody is at risk.
Yeah, if you've made noise, which you probably will have, or even the game on certain player counts start with a certain amount of noise already put into the bag, like your cubes, then yeah, once your cubes are in the bag, you're up for game to being drawn and attacked. And so I think that does kind of bring to mind the one complaint I think of with this game, and it kind of comes more after people have played it more, I would say, is the idea that it is smart, like you mentioned, that the game pushes that kind of race feel, right? Like from the beginning, you do have a sense of like, okay, we're racing. Like we gotta go. I gotta go down a path that this person isn't going, but do it faster than them to get more points and get out before them. But then eventually there's that strategy that someone brings up of like, what if I just like go in, grab like the closest thing and get out, right? Because once someone's out, then the dragon is always attacking on that player's turn. It's kind of like the default action that replaces that player's turn once they're out of the game and safe. And so then it's like, what if I just, get the closest treasure, get out, and hope everyone else dies, you know? And that can be a problem at times, right? In this game, this version of the game.
And I would say it is a strategy. It's something that people can do. You can win that way by forcing people into that position. I would say though that the game is pretty balanced, because despite that happening, I think the worst thing about that happening is it just makes the game a shorter game, right? It just makes it a faster game, and then it's just like, okay, well, the game is just short, and maybe you didn't get to explore as much as you thought you would want to if you were playing and committing time to play a game. But I think we've done it, and we've played the game enough times to that even if you try that strategy, it actually doesn't always work, because you really don't get a lot of points doing that strategy, because the fastest thing you can grab is like worth 5 points, and then escaping is you get another bonus of like I think 20 points or something. So that's pretty much most of the points that you're going to have by the end of the game. But we also know that there's a lot of cards that just by the base value of cards that you can just acquire regularly are worth like 7 or 8 points. And then even basic cards will have, like, certain basic cards do have values to them. And you can pick those up over time throughout playing. So there are still ways to get around it. The hardest thing would be making sure that you're above ground before that trigger happens. So I would say, even though that is a criticism that can come from the game, I also don't think it's the worst thing possible. It just means that people have to realize, like, okay, if this person is just going to run in and run out, like, I need to make sure that I'm getting points in a different way, and make sure that I actually have at least an artifact, right? So that I can come back above ground. Because that's another thing we forgot to mention too, is like once you go underground, you're not allowed to go back above ground until you grab an artifact. And then you can go back above ground, right?
Yeah, one of the kind of game-winning conditions, you need an artifact to get back out. And so, yeah, I mean, I do agree. It doesn't, the strategy of like making it quick, getting close to treasure doesn't ruin it. It does have this kind of balanced feel where it's like, okay, you see someone do that, then it's like, okay, I'm gonna run a little further than that person, get an artifact that's worth more and get out, and you'll
Mhm.
probably be better than that off than that person, right? So
Exactly.
it's true. It's true. I just know people, friends have brought it up, and even whether they've tried it or they just kind of wonder, like, can we do that?
Mhm.
And I think all the points you pointed out about it are correct, right? It kind of just makes the game fast where you don't need to, and it really doesn't guarantee a win. It just kind of seems like a strategy of someone who really wants to win a game
Mhm.
versus enjoying the game.
But even if you're really trying to win the game, I would also say like it as I mentioned with all the points, you're really gambling to do
Hmm.
that.
Hmm.
It's not a surefire way to win. It's just a strategy that and honestly, I don't like I feel like of the times we've played, I feel like it's only happened like maybe once or twice where that
Hmm.
person has won.
Hmm.
And even when they won, it was a very close call for their win.
Hmm.
It was like
Hmm.
it was either like everyone just barely died, and if they didn't die and they had like one movement to get ahead, like out, that other person would have actually won the game. It was just bad luck of like the movement, and then or the other way where it's like they actually don't win because once they leave, you're not allowed to get cards anymore. You're stuck at the amount of points that you have,
Hmm.
versus other players like they can keep accumulating things too. So they can still
Hmm.
get a lot of points and they can get way more points than what you have. See, so
Yeah, and
even
I
then,
mean,
I even question if someone's just trying to quote win, it's not even like a very strong kind of strategy or a very
yeah, and
sound.
like, and to kind of give a sense of the points, like you mentioned, getting around 25, 30 points. I would say if you do that really quick strategy, right,
Mhm.
where like a regular played out game of Clank, people have scores of like 70, 80, I would
80s,
say.
90s. Yeah,
Y-
they get really
Yeah,
high.
and even higher. I've seen higher, but I think
Uh,
like average around there.
mhm.
So it's like the game is meant to kind of be that longer adventure to get up to around those points. And actually, in what you were pointing out, that it did remind me of, again, like another small change from like traditional deck builders, right? Like the points on the cards, right?
Mhm.
Which is this green symbol up here, where that's really cool because, yeah, in like Dominion, when we described it, you'd have to build your deck to then eventually buy cards that don't do anything except give you points, and those go in your deck, kind of slowing it down. Where then in this game, like most of the cards you can buy from the market that you would buy for their ability to do on your turn, whether it's related to movement, generating you some resource, comboing with some other card, they're worth points in themselves. So even just like improving your deck, you're
Mhm.
getting some points over time. And so that's
Exactly.
a really good change, I think,
Yeah,
from traditional deck building.
and I think in that way too, some of the cards that are just high value points cards, they also change like the way that they go around it is it allows you to draw a card when you grab that or like when you have it in your deck. So then it's not wasting space. So
Mhm.
typically when a deck builder, it's like you only get a limited amount of cards in your hand per turn. This card basically replaces itself so that you get a really strong you get the benefit of the points value but you're also not sacrificing your deck's efficiency, right? Because you're
Mhm.
basically always able to replace that card with a drawn card, with a new drawn card,
Mhm.
right? Which is nice, right? Versus Dominion, that's not the case. It's your deck gets more full with stuff.
Mhm. Mhm.
So and,
But
and
then,
it's
of
nice because
course,
then it's like it keeps the flow of this game going where it's like you're still moving, right? You still have options, you have opportunities to do things.
as a deck builder, it still has that part of the strategy of like keeping your deck thin, right? You want to be able to draw the things you want, whether it's more movement cards because that's what you're trying to build around,
Mm-hmm.
or just like a bunch of experience, one of the currencies to buy more cards or specific cards, the ones or the expensive ones. So there's still that part, which
Mm-hmm.
then is kind of the nice strategic part with a deck builder that if it was like a roll and move, it wouldn't have, right? And so Clank, I think overall, actually, let me try to pull
The
up
BGG score.
GGG, BGG score,
BGGGGGG.
GGGG. Um, but then I would say Clank, I mean, we mentioned starting with Dominion as intro to deck building, and I would say that's still true if the person is like has no idea what
Completely
modern
unfamiliar.
board games are like, or like are maybe younger, because I think like college age enough, like they're smart enough to grasp these new kind of mechanics in games. And so, because I played with, I think a few people over the years, like I used, because I don't have Dominion anymore, I used Clank as a way to teach deck building. And as from what we've been saying, I do think it's a more exciting way to play a deck builder.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't find it was too hard for them to grasp. Like, obviously, like, again, I always want to emphasize to people, there's a difference between like learning to play a game and learning to play it well, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I usually tell people not to worry about playing it well, because you don't necessarily have to play it well to enjoy it or want to play it again, John. And but learning the game, just understanding how it works. Like Clank, I think is very simple in that way, right? It's not like a next step from Dominion that you have to play Dominion first to get to.
Mm-hmm.
I think it is simple enough or straightforward enough to be introductory.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with all your points there as well. And I think in that way, it also helps with kind of thematically, if people understand kind of the intent of what the game is about, it also helps people to capture what they're supposed to be doing as you play the game too. It just is one of those ways in which the theme actually does lend some credence to how to learn the game too, and how to think about how you're playing the game as well. Right. I think I think we've mentioned before about games being abstract, where sometimes it's not, you can't really tell what the game is about or kind of its sense. But I think with Clank, it definitely makes sense what you're doing, and it's like it fits together thematically as well, like both gameplay wise and then just what you're doing, right? So
Which I love. I mean, since I care about theme, when it can help people get into a game or understand a game more, like I think that's great. And so my on BGG, my rating is an 8, which
mhm.
I believe is the same rating I gave the Resistance last week,
Yes.
which is fair. If let me just check one thing. So I would say it's fair because it is that solid game that I can easily want to play with people. I think the difference is Resistance needs more people, so it's less often that I
Mhm.
get to play it. But let me see if Clank Space
Has a higher rating or not?
is a high 8.5. Yeah, okay, yeah, then that's right.
That's why.
So I do have that little bit of relative scoring there because that brief little glimpse was Clank Space, which is a different version that came out a year or so after the success that was Clank. And with Clank Space, it has a different theme. It adds some things that make it a little more, people would say, like more gamer like.
Yeah.
Uh, but so I do think Clank Space kind of does improves on Clank, and so that's why there's that kind of relative scoring. Just a point 0.5 difference of saying Clank Space I think is the better one, but Clank being an 8 is still solid, very solid.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely a one that I would play. You see, very good, enjoy playing, and would suggest it, which I do.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that's probably why there's an 8 here as my score for Clank. I don't know. What about you, John?
I think I'm about the same. Like the 8 to the 8.5 with Clank in Space. I think typically if I'm gonna play Clank at all, I think I would usually try to prefer pushing Clank in Space over Clank if I'm already gonna teach it anyway.
Mm.
But I think that is one of the detriments about Clank in Space, and I know we're not really talking about it because it does make the game, like the things that are added into Clank in Space actually do make it pretty complicated in the sense of there are a lot more things you have to watch out and be aware of, where
Mm-hmm.
versus with just Clank
Mm-hmm.
here, like the base Clank,
Mm-hmm.
you don't need to worry about those things as much.
Yeah.
So I would say that from that perspective, I do think that Clank is definitely overall the easier and the better to get people to like, especially if it's their first times in playing, or looking into kind of getting more into it. If they're not people who are familiar with playing board games a lot, Clank is a much better game than Clank in Space, because Clank in Space, again, there is a lot of other aspects to the game, which is also why I think I was looking at the real quick rank difference. Like Clank regular is rated overall higher than Clank in Space, which is quite a bit lower. And I think that is one of the big reasons why there is a difference. Right, rank overall 102 versus Clank regular being 50, because it's just much easier to get into, and you still get the same fun right out of it. It's just, as we mentioned, Clank in Space I think is tailored toward more gamer people, or people who are already very familiar with how to play Clank. So,
and I think the difference between the two is obviously the theme, whether you're interested in fantasy versus sci-fi. Clank in Space is the one that I mentioned, has those Star Trek, Star Wars references and makes fun of those kind of things. But okay, yeah, so an A from both of us. Really solid game. I don't know if you had any final kind of negatives to point out about the game, because I would say, yeah, this is really high up on my personal list, like despite my rating here, like personally, like how often I would play it and such.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't, like, other than the one that we had kind of mentioned of like, there are certain strategies that tend to become the same, or what people kind of typically will aim for in the game. So we were kind of mentioning that there's the person who rushes fast, then there's the person who kind of tries to just sit around and hoard a ton of points before they leave. But I don't think it's a detriment. It's just sometimes if you're doing the same strategy as somebody else, it can really mess up what you're trying to do. And then it does feel like there's really no way. Sometimes it does have that sense of maybe there's no way to get back if your strategy was pursued by somebody else and they did it slightly better. But that's also kind of a typical deck builder thing in general, also, where there is an element of kind of building up. And if your strategy is the same or very similar to somebody else's strategy, whoever does it better is the one who's usually gonna, benefit. The other thing to that too is also the way that the tableau, like, of the cards that you can acquire into your deck are only limited to the 6, and it heavily is dependent on what your resources are. So sometimes there is a card that would be really good for you, and then your turn passes where you could try to acquire, but you just don't have the resources, and it's frustrating because then you get it the next turn, which is, again, also a part of deck building in general. So I wouldn't necessarily say it's a Clank specific issue. It's just that is the same kind of frustration you may encounter as you play this game.
And on that, the point you just said before about someone pursuing the same strategy, I think the interesting thing about that with Clank is it can be a little harder to, in a sense, compare your decks in that way, right? Like you mentally, you could be like, I want to move quickly, or I want to fight monsters easily, and the other person could think the same thing, but then it really comes down to those cards that are revealed, right?
Yeah.
Where in traditional deck builders like Dominion, like, you are buying the same card. So you, in a sense, literally could compare your decks like, oh, at this point,
literally
you bought like 3 copies of this card by now, but you only have 2, of the exact same card in your deck. Where in this, like, you'll have cards that give different amounts of movement and different amounts of combat. So it's like, sure, maybe you got like this one card that has a lot more movement, but then your other cards have less movement, where mine are more like average higher. It's like
spread out.
In a way,
right?
It's harder to compare that way. So that kind of helps with that, I would say.
Yeah. The what would be the other thing I would say, if I have anything? I would say the only other thing that maybe could be frustrating too is sometimes the board movement as well in the game, if you don't plan ahead, or if the way your cards draw just end up being really bad too. Again, not a direct problem with the game mechanically or anything like that. It's, again, more of like the feel of the game. Sometimes you're just like, oh, my deck is like the world of my deck, and all the cards are just not in my favor. Again, it's just more of a what could naturally come out of it. And then so if that's the only time you play the game, it might leave a sour taste. So you
Mm,
should definitely. This is the type of game where I think you get more enjoyment out of it the more times you get to experience it in different ways, right? With
mm.
different strategies, different going through the board, collecting things in time too. So
And that
don't
that is an
it shouldn't
interesting
only be based on a
consideration.
single play.
That
So
is an interesting consideration, like compared to, or to basically get you thinking of if you prefer, like if there's kind of this spectrum of these mechanics, right? If you prefer like deck building, which is less random than dice rolling, but then more random than like another game we talked about, Pandemic, where it's action points, like you literally choose what you do every turn,
mhm.
right? And so that's kind of an interesting consideration, and to kind of realize as you play these games, right? Like which of those do you prefer more, right? And in that way, I would say that's why maybe this deck building in Clank works for me, because I have mentioned that I always want a little bit of luck in my game. And so it is a step away from just pure action points and using those to decide my actions every turn, but it's not dice rolling. So
Mhm.
so that's maybe why it kind of works for me in this way.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, no, Clank is super solid, right? It doesn't get you don't get high ratings like eights and higher without being a very just fundamentally solid game.
Yeah, top
So
100 on BGG.
mhm. Almost top
So
50,
yeah, almost.
almost.
And then for those of you who are interested in Clank, yeah, I would definitely recommend checking it out, trying it out. It is maybe on the pricier side. I want to say around 40 to 50 retail, maybe
I
50
think it's
retail
closer to
online. Maybe you can get it for 40,
yeah,
45.
it's closer
Um,
to 50, I think, typically,
mhm.
just standardly. But
Um, but then also Clank has its expansions. I don't remember the name of all of them because they kind of alternated releasing these. Like there was one expansion for Clank first, and then the one for Clank in Space, and Clank again, Clank in Space. And so for Clank, at least there's at least two expansions, like a sunken, like an underwater one, and then like a Egyptian one, which adds like another board and other mechanics and cards. If you're the type to enjoy expanding on this game. And then the big release it had, I think end of last year, was Clank Legacy. So again, another in the line of legacy games that got really good reviews though, which John and I are hoping to play someday when we can play again someday.
yeah,
But yes, a
there's no
legacy version of
pandemic.
Clank. And so that's just to let you know how well the game is done. It's published by Renegade Games, which was one of those small studios from San Diego, which didn't even have like an an office building. I think they work like remotely. It's like mainly two people, and then they've kind of expanded to maybe having a little studio where they shoot their videos, I'm guessing. But yeah, they were like really big when they started coming out with Clank, and then a bunch of little small games. So they're definitely a publisher that's been doing really well.
Mhm.
And so yeah, that's just something else to point out. Renegade Games is maybe one to look out for if you enjoy their games like Clank. And so with that, thanks for watching. Hope you guys get to try the game at some point. And if you found this useful, please comment, share this with your friends. And until next time, thanks for watching. Bye.
Goodbye.